I thought I knew my mother. I thought I knew the man I'd fallen in love with. But that night, when Leo walked into our family dining room and spoke those 4 simple words to my mother, everything I believed about my life crumbled like ancient parchment. The silence that followed was so thick it could have suffocated us all. My mother's wine glass trembled in her manicured fingers, and I saw something in her eyes I'd never seen before. Pure, undiluted fear. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support means everything to me. My name is Ivy Thornfield, and I've always lived in the shadow of privilege. At 27, I teach English literature at a private academy, following in the footsteps of my mother, Professor Evelyn Thornfield, or rather, former Professor Thornfield. She retired early from the university to focus on what she called cultivating society, which really meant hosting dinner parties, where she could display her intellectual superiority like a peacock showing its feathers. Our family estate sits on 12 acres of pristine Connecticut countryside, complete with manicured gardens and a library that rivals some small colleges. Growing up, I thought this was normal. I thought everyone's mother could recite Chaucer in Middle English while arranging orchids, or that every family discussed philosophical paradoxes over breakfast. It wasn't until college that I realized how insulated my world had been. My mother had carefully constructed our social circle, surrounding us with people who shared her views on class, education, and what she called natural hierarchy. She believed some people were simply born to lead, to teach, to matter, and others were born to follow, to learn, to serve. I rebelled against this thinking, which is probably why I fell so hard for Leo Martinez. I met Leo 6 months ago at a coffee shop near the school where I teach. He was reading Neruda in Spanish, his dark hair falling across his forehead as he concentrated, completely absorbed in the poetry. Something about the way he held the book, with reverence, like it contained secrets, made me approach him. "That's beautiful," I said, nodding toward the book, though I prefer his English translations. He looked up with eyes the color of dark chocolate and smiled. The translation loses something, don't you think? Te amo sin saber cómo, ni cuándo, ni de dónde becomes I love you without knowing how or when or from where, but the Spanish has a music to it that English can't capture. We talked for 3 hours that day. He told me he was a freelance translator, working mostly with legal documents and technical manuals to pay the bills, but poetry was his passion. He'd grown up in Hartford, raised by his grandmother after his parents died in a car accident when he was 12. He'd earned a scholarship to the university, the same university where my mother had taught, but dropped out in his sophomore year. "Why?" I asked. His jaw tightened slightly. "Let's just say I wasn't a good fit for academic life. I should have pressed him then, but I was too enchanted by his intelligence, his gentle humor, the way he could make me see literature through completely new eyes." Leo had a way of understanding people that went beyond surface-level analysis. When I told him about struggling with my mother's expectations, he listened without judgment, offering insights that helped me understand my own feelings better. For 6 months, I lived in 2 worlds. During the week, I was with Leo, eating at hole-in-the-wall restaurants, walking through Hartford's parks, discussing books and dreams and the kind of future we might build together. On weekends, I returned to my family's estate, keeping Leo's existence carefully separate from my mother's scrutiny. But as our relationship deepened, that separation became impossible to maintain. Leo started asking questions about my family, wondering why he'd never met them. And my mother, sharp as ever, began noticing my distraction, my happiness, my frequent absences. "You're glowing, darling," she said one Sunday afternoon, as we walked through her rose garden. "There's a man, isn't there?" I couldn't lie to her. Despite everything, despite our philosophical differences, she was still my mother. I still craved her approval, even as I rebelled against her values. "Yes," I admitted. "His name is Leo. He's wonderful, Mom." She stopped walking and turned to face me, her green eyes, so like my own, calculating. "Tell me about him." I chose my words carefully. "He's intelligent, kind, passionate about literature. He's a translator. Education? Some college." Her perfectly sculpted eyebrow arched. "Some college? He's self-educated now. You'd be impressed by his knowledge, truly." "Background?" The questions felt like an interrogation, but I pressed on. "He grew up in Hartford. His grandmother raised him after his parents died." Something flickered across her face. Disapproval, I thought, but there was something else, something that made my stomach clench with unease. "I see," she said coolly. "Well, I suppose it's time we met this paragon of self-education." The way she said it made my blood run cold, but I was trapped. I'd opened the door, and now I had to walk through it. "I'll arrange dinner," she continued. "This Saturday. Nothing formal, just family." Nothing was ever just anything with my mother. I called Leo that evening, my hands shaking as I dialed his number. When I told him about the dinner invitation, he was quiet for a long moment. "Are you sure about this?" he asked finally. "What do you mean?" "I mean, are you sure you want me to meet your family? Once I do, there's no going back. You'll know exactly what they think of someone like me." "Someone like you?" "Someone from my background. Someone without the right credentials, the right pedigree." His voice was gentle but firm. "I've been in these situations before, Ivy. I know how they end. My mother can be challenging," I admitted, "but she's not cruel, and she loves me. If she sees how much you mean to me—" "All right," he said, cutting off my rambling reassurances. "Saturday it is." But there was something in his tone that made me wonder if he knew something I didn't. The days leading up to Saturday passed in a haze of anxiety. I found myself second-guessing every choice. What to wear, how to prepare Leo, how to prepare my mother. I coached Leo on my mother's interests, her academic background, her particular passions. I even bought him a new shirt, which he accepted with an amused smile. "You're more nervous than I am," he observed as we drove up the winding driveway to my family's estate on Saturday evening. He was right. My palms were sweating, and I kept adjusting the rearview mirror to check my appearance. Leo, meanwhile, looked perfectly calm, almost expectant. "She's going to love you," I said, more to convince myself than him. Leo took my hand and squeezed it gently. "Whatever happens tonight, remember that I love you. That's not going to change." The intensity in his voice made me look at him sharply, but before I could ask what he meant, we were pulling into the circular drive. My mother waited on the front steps, impeccably dressed in a silk blouse and tailored pants, her silver hair pulled back in an elegant chignon. She looked every inch the refined academic, and I felt a familiar stab of inadequacy. Even at 58, she was stunning, the kind of woman who commanded attention and respect wherever she went. "Darling," she called out as I approached, her arms extended for her customary air-kiss greeting. Over my shoulder, I saw her eyes fix on Leo with the intensity of a scientist examining a specimen. "Mom, I'd like you to meet Leo Martinez," I said, turning to bring him forward. "Leo, this is my mother, Evelyn Thornfield." Leo stepped forward with a slight smile, extending his hand. "Mrs. Thornfield, it's a pleasure to meet Dr. Thornfield," my mother corrected coolly, not taking his hand. I still use my academic title. The snub was subtle but unmistakable. Leo's hand hung in the air for a moment before he smoothly lowered it, his smile never wavering. "Of course, Dr. Thornfield." He inclined his head slightly. "Thank you for inviting me to your home." She looked him up and down with barely concealed disdain, taking in his simple button-down shirt, his clean but unpretentious appearance, his obvious discomfort with the opulence surrounding us. "Well," she said finally, "shall we go inside? I'm curious to hear about your work." The way she said work made it sound like a foreign concept, something distasteful she was forced to acknowledge. Dinner was a disaster from the moment we sat down. My mother had set the dining room table with her finest china, the Wedgwood set that had been in our family for generations. Crystal glasses caught the light from the chandelier, and fresh flowers from her garden created an elegant centerpiece. It was beautiful, but it was also intimidating, and I could see Leo taking it all in with those dark, thoughtful eyes. "So, Leo," my mother began, as our housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, served the first course. "Ivy tells me you're a translator. How interesting. What languages do you work with?" "Primarily Spanish and English," Leo replied politely. "Some Portuguese and Italian as well." "Self-taught, I assume?" The question was loaded with condescension. I shot my mother a warning look, but she ignored me. "Partially," Leo said. "I had some formal training in college before I left." "Ah, yes. Ivy mentioned you didn't finish your degree. What a shame. Education is so important, don't you think?" She took a delicate sip of her wine. "I always told my students that without proper academic training, one can never truly understand the nuances of language and literature." I felt heat rise to my cheeks. "Mom, it's all right," Leo said quietly. His voice was steady, but I noticed his jaw had tightened almost imperceptibly. Not everyone is cut out for traditional academic environments. "Indeed," my mother agreed. "Some people simply lack the intellectual rigor required for serious scholarly work. There's no shame in recognizing one's limitations. The words hit like physical blows. I wanted to sink through the floor. This was worse than I'd feared. My mother wasn't just being snobbish. She was being openly cruel. "I'm curious," she continued, warming to her subject. "What made you decide to leave university? Financial difficulties? Academic struggles?" "Mom, please," I started, but Leo held up a hand to stop me. "Actually, Dr. Thornfield," he said, his voice taking on a different quality, still polite, but with an undertone I couldn't quite identify. "I left because I realized that some professors care more about maintaining their own sense of superiority than actually educating their students." My mother's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "How unfortunate that you had such a negative experience. Though I must say, students who struggle academically often blame their professors rather than taking responsibility for their own shortcomings." The cruelty in her voice made me flinch. I'd never seen this side of my mother before. This cold, calculating cruelty, disguised as academic discourse. "You're absolutely right," Leo said, his tone conversational. "I've seen that happen. Students who don't fit the professor's idea of what a scholar should look like. Maybe they come from the wrong background, or they don't have the right accent, or they wear the wrong clothes. Sometimes they get written off before they even have a chance to prove themselves." Something flickered in my mother's eyes. "Academic standards exist for a reason, Mr. Martinez. Not everyone is meant for higher education." "No," Leo agreed. "Some people are meant to teach it, and some people are meant to learn from it. But the best teachers understand that wisdom can come from anywhere, even from a scholarship kid who grew up in Hartford." The silence that followed was deafening. My mother had gone very still, her wineglass frozen halfway to her lips. I looked between them, confused by the sudden tension that had nothing to do with mere class differences. "Leo," I said carefully. "What? Nice to see you again, Professor," Leo said quietly, his eyes never leaving my mother's face. The wineglass slipped from my mother's fingers and shattered on her plate. Time seemed to stop. The crystal shards glittered like diamonds against the white china, and the red wine spread across the tablecloth like blood. My mother stared at Leo with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of shock, recognition, and something that looked almost like terror. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice sounding strange and distant. "I don't understand. You two know each other?" Leo's eyes remained fixed on my mother's face. "We've met before, haven't we, Dr. Thornfield?" My mother's composure cracked like ice in spring. Her perfectly controlled expression crumbled, revealing something raw and panicked underneath. I don't. There must be some mistake." "No mistake," Leo said calmly. "English Literature 301, fall semester 2018. You probably don't remember me. I was just another scholarship student who didn't belong." The words hit me like a physical blow. 2018. That was 7 years ago, when Leo would have been 20. Just a kid, really. A kid who'd lost his parents and was trying to build a future on a scholarship. "I remember now," my mother whispered, her voice hoarse. "Leonardo Martinez, you do remember." Leo's smile was sharp as a blade. "I'm touched, though I have to admit, I'm surprised you recognized me. You barely looked at me when I was in your class." I looked between them, my mind reeling. You were my mother's student? For exactly 6 weeks," Leo said, his voice carefully controlled, "until I dropped out." "You failed," my mother said suddenly, her voice gaining strength as she tried to reassert control. "You couldn't handle the coursework." Leo laughed, and the sound was bitter. "Is that the story you tell yourself?" "Leo," I said, my voice pleading. "What happened? What really happened?" He turned to look at me, and I saw pain in his dark eyes. Old pain, carefully buried but never fully healed. "Your mother made it very clear that I didn't belong in her classroom, or anywhere else in the academic world for that matter." "That's not," my mother started, but Leo continued. "The first day of class, she looked at my scholarship notification and announced to the entire room that she hoped all students would maintain the high standards befitting a prestigious institution, regardless of their background." He paused, letting the word hang in the air. "Then she made me introduce myself and explain exactly how I'd earned my place at the university." I felt sick. "Mom, you didn't—" She had me read my essay aloud, the one I'd written about my parents' death and how it had shaped my love of literature. She said it was important for the class to understand different perspectives on tragedy. Leo's voice was steady, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. Then she critiqued it, publicly. Said it was emotionally manipulative and lacked intellectual rigor. My mother had gone pale. I was teaching you to strengthen your writing. You were humiliating me. Leo cut her off. Week after week, every paper I turned in, you'd find reasons to read it aloud and tear it apart. You'd make little comments about natural talent versus learned skill. You'd assign me extra work to help me catch up to my more prepared classmates. I stared at my mother in horror. This couldn't be true. My mother, for all her faults, was a teacher. She believed in education, in helping students grow. Other professors started noticing. Leo continued. Dr. Morrison from the Spanish department asked me what was wrong, said I seemed withdrawn, that my work in other classes was suffering, but I was too proud to admit what was happening, too ashamed. You were struggling, my mother began weakly. I was broken, Leo said simply, and you knew it. The final straw was the midterm presentation. I'd prepared for weeks, researched everything about Garcia Lorca and his influence on modern poetry, but when I got up to speak, you interrupted me after 2 minutes. His voice grew quieter, more controlled. You said, Mr. Martinez, while your enthusiasm is admirable, perhaps you could explain why you think your interpretation carries the same weight as established scholars who have spent decades studying this material. Then you asked if I thought my personal background gave me special insight into tragedy that might escape more traditional students. I felt tears burning my eyes. Oh, Leo. The whole class laughed, he continued. Not mean laughter. They were just following your lead. But I stood there, 20 years old, holding my notes about a poet who'd been murdered for his beliefs, and I realized that I was the joke. I was the diversity admission, the charity case, the scholarship kid who thought he could play with the big boys. My mother's face was white as paper. I was pushing you to be better. You were destroying me, Leo said, his voice finally showing emotion. I stopped eating, stopped sleeping, started having panic attacks in other classes. My grandmother begged me to talk to someone, but I was too ashamed. Finally, I just quit, walked away from everything I'd worked for. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. I looked at my mother, this woman I'd respected, admired, tried to live up to, and saw a stranger. Why didn't you tell me? I whispered to Leo. Because I was afraid, he admitted. When I realized who you were, when I learned your last name, I almost walked away. But then I got to know you, and you were nothing like her. You saw students as individuals, not categories. You treated everyone with respect. He looked at my mother, and his expression was both sad and resolute. I stayed because I realized that children aren't responsible for their parents' sins, and I wanted to see if Ivy was different. She is. My mother found her voice at last. I don't remember it that way. I'm sure you don't, Leo said, but I have documentation. Emails you sent to my advisor, notes from your meetings with the financial aid office where you questioned whether I was university material. I kept everything. The color drained from my mother's face entirely. You can't. You wouldn't. Wouldn't what? Expose you? Ruin your reputation? Leo shook his head. I'm not you, Professor. I don't destroy people for sport. I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor. I need some air. I stumbled toward the French doors that led to the garden, desperate to escape the suffocating atmosphere of revelations and recriminations. Behind me, I heard my mother's voice, high and strained. Ivy, wait, let me explain. But I was already outside, gulping the cool evening air like a drowning woman breaking the surface. The garden that had always been my sanctuary now felt like a stage set, beautiful but artificial, hiding ugly truths beneath its manicured perfection. Leo followed me out, closing the door gently behind him. I'm sorry, he said softly. I didn't want you to find out like this. I turned to face him, tears streaming down my cheeks. Is this why you were with me? Some kind of revenge? The question hung between us like a blade. For a moment, I thought I'd destroyed everything. But then Leo's face crumpled with pain. God, no. Ivy, no. He reached for me, then stopped himself. I was terrified you'd think that. It's why I tried so hard to stay away from this world, from her. I fell in love with you despite who your mother is. Not because of it. But you knew. From the beginning, you knew. Not from the beginning. When we first met, you were just Ivy, a beautiful, intelligent woman who saw poetry the way I did. It wasn't until our third date, when you mentioned your mother was a former English professor, that I started to suspect. And when you said her name, He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I'd come to know meant he was struggling with difficult emotions. I should have walked away then, but I was already falling for you, and I convinced myself it didn't matter. Your mother was part of your past, not your present. We could build something separate from all that. But you couldn't, could you? I said, understanding dawning. That's why you've been asking about my family. That's why you agreed to dinner tonight. Leo nodded slowly. I needed to know if you were like her, if this was all some elaborate setup, if you'd turn on me the moment you learned the truth about my background. He looked at me with desperate hope. But you're not like her, Ivy. You're nothing like her. Through the French doors, I could see my mother sitting alone at the table, staring at the wine stain spreading across the white tablecloth. She looked smaller somehow, diminished. What am I supposed to do now? I whispered. She's my mother. I know, Leo said softly, and I know this is killing you. But you needed to know who she really is. Did I? I wanted to argue, to defend her, but the words wouldn't come. Because deep down, I was starting to remember things, little moments over the years that I'd dismissed or rationalized. Comments she'd made about certain types of students, the way she'd spoken about diversity initiatives, her disdain for what she called lowered standards. I'd always assumed she was just old-fashioned, set in her ways, but now I was seeing a pattern of cruelty disguised as academic rigor. There's more, isn't there? I asked, dreading the answer. Leo hesitated. I wasn't the only one. The words hit me like a physical blow. How many? I don't know exactly. But after I left, I heard stories. Other scholarship students who'd had similar experiences with her. A young woman from Puerto Rico who switched majors after your mother made her feel like she couldn't possibly understand British literature. A first-generation college student who dropped out entirely after your mother publicly questioned whether his ideas were sophisticated enough for university-level discussion. I sank onto one of the garden benches, overwhelmed. Why didn't anyone report her? Who would believe us? She was careful, never crossing any official lines. And she was Professor Evelyn Thornfield, respected, tenured, connected. We were just struggling students from the wrong backgrounds. Leo sat beside me, careful not to touch me without permission. The system protected her, not us. Inside the house, I could see my mother moving around the dining room, mechanically cleaning up the broken glass. She looked like she was moving underwater, each motion deliberate and strange. Is that why she retired early? I asked. I don't know. Maybe. Or maybe she just got tired of pretending to care about education, when what she really cared about was maintaining her sense of superiority. The pieces were falling into place now. My mother's early retirement, her focus on social circles instead of teaching, her careful cultivation of an image as a refined intellectual. Had she been running from something? Had her cruelty finally caught up with her? I need to go back in there, I said finally. I need to hear her side. Leo nodded. Do you want me to leave? I looked at him. This man I'd fallen in love with, who'd survived something terrible, and somehow found the strength to love me despite it. No, stay. I need you to stay. We walked back into the house together. My mother was standing by the window, her back to us, her shoulders rigid with tension. Mom, I said softly. She turned, and I saw that she'd been crying. Her carefully applied makeup was smudged, and her eyes were red and puffy. She looked older than I'd ever seen her. I suppose you want an explanation, she said, her voice hoarse. I want the truth. She laughed bitterly. The truth. Such a simple concept for such a complicated world. She moved to the sideboard and poured herself another glass of wine with shaking hands. You want to know why I treated him the way I did? Why I treated any of them that way? Yes. My mother took a long sip of wine, then set the glass down carefully. Because I was afraid. Afraid of what? Of being exposed. Of having my limitations revealed. She looked at Leo with something that might have been shame. You were brilliant, you know. Your essays, your insights. They were fresh, original, unencumbered by the academic baggage the rest of us carry around. You saw things that I, with all my degrees and publications, had missed. Leo stared at her in shock. What? Your analysis of Garcia Lorca, the one I humiliated you for. It was groundbreaking. It challenged conventional interpretations in ways that made me question everything I thought I knew about his work. Her voice grew stronger, more bitter. And you were 20 years old, a kid from Hartford who'd never had the advantages I'd had. If you could see things I couldn't, what did that say about me? I felt the world shifting around me again. So you destroyed him to protect yourself? I destroyed him because I was a coward, my mother said simply. I'd built my entire identity around being superior, around being the expert, the authority. I couldn't handle the idea that wisdom might come from unexpected places. She turned to Leo, and for the first time since he'd revealed their connection, she looked directly at him. "I'm sorry. That's inadequate, I know. But I'm sorry. What I did to you was unforgivable." Leo was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful, controlled. "Why are you telling us this now?" "Because I'm tired," she said simply. "I'm tired of being afraid, tired of maintaining this facade, tired of living in a world where I have to diminish others to feel good about myself." She looked at me with something that might have been hope. "And because I love my daughter, and I can see that she loves you." The admission hung in the air between us. I wanted to forgive her, to believe that this moment of honesty meant everything could be different now. But I also knew that sorry didn't undo years of damage, didn't give Leo back the education he'd lost, didn't heal the other students she'd hurt. "What happens now?" I asked. My mother straightened, and for a moment, I saw a glimpse of the strong woman she could have been, the teacher she should have been. "Now I try to make amends," she said. "I can't undo what I did, but I can try to do better going forward." "How?" She was quiet for a moment, thinking. "I could start by reaching out to the students I hurt, apologizing, offering to write letters of recommendation, to help them in whatever way I can." She looked at Leo. "If you'll let me." Leo studied her face, and I could see him weighing her words, trying to decide if they were genuine. "What about the others? The students who dropped out, who gave up on their dreams because of what you did?" "I'll find them," my mother said, "however long it takes, whatever it costs. I'll find them, and I'll try to make it right. It wasn't enough. It couldn't be enough, but it was a start." "And what about us?" I asked, gesturing between Leo and myself. "What about our relationship?" My mother looked at us both, and for the first time that evening, her smile was genuine. "I think you found something rare and precious. Don't let my mistakes destroy it." She moved toward the door, then paused. "I'll leave you two alone to talk. I have a lot of thinking to do." After she left, Leo and I sat in the elegant dining room surrounded by the detritus of our shattered evening. Broken glass, spilled wine, the remains of a dinner none of us had been able to eat. "Are we okay?" I asked finally. Leo reached for my hand, intertwining our fingers. "I don't know," he said honestly. "This changes things. Not between us, but your mother will always be part of your life, and she'll always be part of mine now too. Can you forgive her?" He was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know if I can forgive her, but maybe I can understand her, and maybe that's enough to start with." I squeezed his hand. "I love you. That hasn't changed." "I love you too," he said, bringing my hand to his lips. "But we have work to do, both of us. We need to figure out how to build a life together that acknowledges the past without being trapped by it. It wouldn't be easy." My mother's revelation had opened wounds that might never fully heal, and exposed truths that would change everything about how I saw my family, my upbringing, my own identity. But as I sat there holding Leo's hand, I realized that maybe that wasn't entirely a bad thing. Maybe some truths needed to be exposed, no matter how painful. Maybe some facades needed to crumble before anything real could be built in their place. The weeks that followed were unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It was as if someone had taken a sledgehammer to the foundation of my life, leaving me to sift through the rubble and decide what was worth salvaging. My mother, true to her word, began the difficult process of attempting to make amends. I watched her struggle with a humility that was foreign to her nature, saw her grapple with the reality of the harm she'd caused. It wasn't pretty, and it wasn't easy, but it was genuine. She started by reaching out to Leo's former advisor, Dr. Morrison, who confirmed what Leo had told us. There had been concerns about my mother's treatment of certain students, but the complaints had been subtle, difficult to prove, and ultimately dismissed by a system that protected senior faculty. She was brilliant, Dr. Morrison told me when I met with him privately. But brilliance without compassion can be destructive. I tried to talk to her about it once, but she dismissed my concerns as lowered standards. My mother also began the process of tracking down the other students she'd hurt. It was painful work. Many of them had changed their names, moved away, built new lives far from the academic world that had rejected them. Some refused to speak with her at all. Others hung up the phone the moment they heard her voice, but a few were willing to listen. Maria Santos had been one of my mother's students in 2016. She'd switched from English to social work, after what she described as a systematic campaign of humiliation that had convinced her she wasn't smart enough for literary analysis. Your mother made me feel like my interpretations were worthless because they came from my experience as a Puerto Rican woman, Maria told me when I called her. She said literature was about universal human experiences, not identity politics. Maria had gone on to become a successful social worker, but she'd never stopped loving literature. When my mother reached out to her with an apology and an offer to write a letter of recommendation for the master's program Maria had always dreamed of pursuing, Maria was skeptical but willing to listen. I don't need her validation anymore, Maria told me, but if this helps her become a better person, and if it helps other students avoid what I went through, then maybe it's worth it. The conversation that broke my heart was with David Chen, a first-generation college student who dropped out entirely after a semester in my mother's Victorian literature course. He'd been working 3 jobs to pay for school, sleeping 4 hours a night, and pouring everything he had into his studies. I wrote a paper about Dickens and social justice, he told me over coffee at a diner in Boston, where he now worked as a carpenter. I connected it to my father's experience as an immigrant, the way economic inequality shaped our family's life. Your mother said it was reductive and inappropriate. She suggested I take remedial writing courses. David had left school that semester and never returned. He'd married his high school girlfriend, had 2 children, and built a successful contracting business. But there was a wistfulness in his voice when he talked about the books he still read in his spare time, the education he'd abandoned. I never stopped wondering if she was right, he admitted. If maybe I wasn't cut out for that world after all. When my mother called David to apologize and offer to help him return to school if he wanted, he cried. Not because he planned to take her up on the offer. His life was full and happy now, but because someone had finally acknowledged what had been done to him. Leo was dealing with his own complex feelings about my mother's attempts at redemption. Part of him wanted to forgive and move forward, but another part remained angry and skeptical. Words are easy, he said one evening as we walked through Hartford's Bushnell Park. She's good with words. It's actions that matter. But gradually, as my mother's efforts continued, I saw something shift in him. When she offered to write him a letter of recommendation for graduate school, he initially refused. But when she followed up by connecting him with a publisher who was interested in his poetry translations, he began to soften. She doesn't have to do this, he said after a particularly successful meeting with the publisher. She could have apologized and left it at that, but she's actually trying to help me build the career she almost destroyed. The breakthrough came 3 months after that disastrous dinner. My mother had managed to track down Marcus Williams, a scholarship student from 2017 who'd struggled in her contemporary poetry course. Marcus had eventually graduated, but had given up his dream of becoming a teacher after my mother's constant criticism convinced him he wasn't inspiring enough for the profession. Marcus was now working at a nonprofit in Philadelphia, and when my mother reached out to him, he agreed to meet with her. I wasn't there for their conversation, but my mother told me about it later, her voice shaking with emotion. "He's brilliant," she said. "Absolutely brilliant. He had insights about contemporary poetry that were revolutionary, but I was so threatened by his perspective that I shut him down at every turn." She paused, wiping tears from her eyes. He told me he'd dreamed of teaching since he was 12 years old, but I convinced him he wasn't good enough. I stole that dream from him. The meeting had lasted 4 hours. Marcus had told my mother about the panic attacks he'd developed in her class, the way her criticism had made him question everything he thought he knew about literature and teaching. But he'd also listened as she explained her own fears and insecurities, her need to maintain superiority at any cost. At the end, my mother said, he told me something I'll never forget. He said Professor Thornfield, I forgive you, not because what you did was okay, but because carrying this anger is hurting me more than it's hurting you. Marcus had recently been accepted to a master's program in education, with my mother's recommendation. But more importantly, he was finally pursuing his dream of becoming a teacher. He's going to be extraordinary, my mother said. The kind of teacher I should have been. That conversation marked a turning point for Leo as well. Seeing my mother's genuine remorse and her commitment to making concrete changes had begun to heal something in him. Not the wounds themselves. Those would always be there. But his relationship to them. I'm not ready to have Sunday dinner with her, he told me one evening. But I'm ready to try being in the same room without wanting to destroy everything she holds dear. It was progress. My own relationship with my mother became something entirely new during this period. For the first time in my life, I saw her as a flawed human being rather than an untouchable authority figure. It was terrifying and liberating at the same time. "I don't know how to be your mother anymore," she admitted during one of our long walks through the garden. "I built my whole identity around being superior, being right. If I'm not that, what am I?" "You're someone who's learning," I told her. "Someone who's trying to do better. Maybe that's enough." But even as I watched my mother's transformation, I struggled with my own complicity in the system she'd created. How many times had I benefited from the very privilege that had harmed Leo and the others? How many opportunities had I received simply because I fit the mold of what an academic was supposed to look like? These questions haunted me as I returned to my own teaching. I found myself looking at my students with new eyes, wondering who I might be unconsciously favoring or dismissing. I changed my grading practices, my discussion formats, my entire approach to creating an inclusive classroom. One day, a student named Jamal approached me after class. He was a scholarship student from New Haven, the first in his family to attend college, and he'd been struggling with confidence in our Shakespeare course. "Professor Thornfield," he said hesitantly, "I wanted to thank you for what you said about different interpretations being valuable. My perspective on Othello, about race and power, I was afraid to share it because I thought it wasn't academic enough." His words hit me like a bolt of lightning. "Your perspective is exactly what makes the discussion richer," I told him. "Don't ever apologize for bringing your full self to the literature." Later that evening, I called my mother and told her about the conversation. "That could have been Leo," she said quietly. 7 years ago, that could have been Leo. What would you have said to him then?" She was quiet for a long moment. I would have told him his interpretation was interesting, but perhaps not rigorous enough for serious academic discussion. I would have suggested he focus on more traditional analytical approaches. Her voice broke slightly. "I would have destroyed his confidence just like I destroyed Leo's. But you didn't say that to Jamal today." "I did the opposite." "Yes," she said. "You did what I should have done. You're the teacher I could have been." It was a strange role reversal, me teaching my mother about teaching, but it felt right somehow, like we were finally having the conversations we should have been having all along. Leo's healing process was more complicated. Even as he began to forgive my mother, he still struggled with the long-term effects of what she'd done to him. The confidence he'd lost as a 20-year-old wasn't easily rebuilt. "Sometimes I still hear her voice in my head," he confessed one night as we lay in bed. "When I'm working on a translation or writing something of my own, I hear her asking if I really think my interpretation carries the same weight as established scholars. And what do you do when that happens?" I try to remember that she was wrong, that my voice, my perspective, my background, they're not limitations, they're strengths. He turned to look at me in the darkness, and I remember that you believe in me, even when I don't believe in myself. The work my mother was doing to make amends wasn't just changing her relationship with her former students. It was changing her entire worldview. She began reading books by authors she'd previously dismissed, attending lectures by scholars whose work she'd considered beneath her notice. "I'm learning," she told me one afternoon as we sorted through her old lecture notes. "At 68 years old, I'm finally learning that I don't know everything." She showed me some of the essays she'd kept from her former students, including Leo's original papers that she'd criticized so harshly. Reading them now, with fresh eyes, she could see their brilliance. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a passage in Leo's analysis of Garcia Lorca. He connected the poet's exploration of love and death to the immigrant experience in a way that was completely original. I was so threatened by his insight that I couldn't see its value. She'd also kept some of her own comments on these papers, and reading them now made us both wince. The red ink was brutal, dismissive, designed to wound rather than educate. "I was a bully," she said simply, "an intellectual bully who used my position to make students feel small." "Why are you showing me this?" I asked. "Because I want you to understand what I'm trying to atone for, and because I want you to promise me something." "What?" "Promise me you'll never let power corrupt you the way it corrupted me. Promise me you'll remember that teaching is about lifting students up, not tearing them down." It was a promise I made gladly, but also one that came with a heavy weight of responsibility. 6 months after our catastrophic dinner, my mother did something that surprised everyone. She applied to volunteer as a literacy tutor at a community center in Hartford, the same neighborhood where Leo had grown up. "I want to give back," she explained when Leo and I expressed our shock. "I want to use my skills to help people who've been dismissed by the system I was part of." Leo was skeptical. "You think working with kids in my old neighborhood is going to absolve you of what you did?" "No," my mother said firmly. "I think it's going to teach me things I should have learned decades ago, and I think it's going to help me become the person I should have been all along." The community center was skeptical too. Evelyn Thornfield, with her designer clothes and patrician accent, seemed like exactly the wrong person to work with children from working-class families. But she persisted, volunteering 4 days a week, working with kids who reminded her of her former students. "They're so hungry to learn," she told me after her first month, "and so afraid of making mistakes, just like Leo was, just like all of them were." One of her students was 8-year-old Carmen, whose parents worked double shifts and spoke limited English. Carmen was bright, but struggled with reading comprehension, and she'd internalized the message that she wasn't smart enough for school. "She reminds me of myself at that age," my mother said, "except I had every advantage, and she has none. But her potential is unlimited if someone just believes in her." Watching my mother work with Carmen and the other children was a revelation. Gone was the condescending professor who'd humiliated her students. In her place was a patient, encouraging teacher who celebrated every small victory and helped her students build confidence along with skills. "Professor Ev is the best," Carmen told me when I visited the center. "She says I'm going to be a writer someday, and she's teaching me all the big words." Leo came with me to that visit, his first time seeing my mother in her new role. I watched him observe her interactions with the children, the way she knelt down to their level, the genuine joy on her face when they succeeded, the gentle way she corrected their mistakes. "She's different," he said quietly as we walked back to the car. "Does it make a difference? For you, I mean." He was quiet for a long moment. "It doesn't undo what she did, but it shows me that people can change, really change, not just say they're going to change." That evening, Leo did something he hadn't done since that terrible dinner. He called my mother voluntarily. "I wanted to thank you," he said when she answered, "for what you're doing at the center. Those kids need someone who believes in them." "I'm learning from them as much as I'm teaching them," my mother replied. "Maybe more." "I know the feeling," Leo said. "That's what good teaching does. It goes both ways." It was the first real conversation they'd had since the revelation, and it opened the door to something new between them. Not friendship exactly, but a mutual respect built on shared understanding of what education could and should be. As summer turned to fall, I found myself reflecting on how much had changed since that night when Leo had spoken those 4 simple words that shattered my world. The family I'd thought I knew had been revealed as something much darker and more complicated. The man I loved had been revealed to have depths of pain and resilience I'd never imagined, and I'd been forced to confront my own role in perpetuating systems of privilege and exclusion. But something beautiful had emerged from the wreckage. My mother was becoming the teacher she should have always been. Leo was reclaiming the academic dreams he'd been forced to abandon, and I was learning to use my privilege to lift others up rather than maintain barriers. The healing wasn't complete, might never be complete, but it was real, and it was ongoing, and it was built on truth rather than the careful lies we'd all been telling ourselves. "Do you think she's really changed?" Leo asked me one evening as we watched my mother help Carmen with a particularly challenging book. "I think she's changing," I said. "Every day, a little bit more." "And us? Do you think we're going to make it?" I looked at him, this man who'd survived academic cruelty and found the strength to love the daughter of his tormentor, who was building a new life from the ashes of his old dreams. "I think we're going to do more than make it," I said. "I think we're going to build something beautiful." 1 year after that devastating dinner, Leo and I decided to host Thanksgiving at his grandmother's house in Hartford. It was a small gathering, just the 3 of us, plus my mother and Carmen and her parents, whom my mother had grown close to through her work at the community center. Leo's grandmother, Abuela Rosa, was 85 years old and sharper than most people half her age. She'd been suspicious of my mother at first, protective of Leo after everything he'd been through. "So you're the profesora who broke my nieto's heart," she'd said when they first met, her dark eyes fierce with protective love. My mother had faced that accusation head-on. "Yes, I am, and I'm trying to spend the rest of my life making up for it." Abuela Rosa had studied my mother for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Bueno, we all make mistakes. The measure of a person is what they do after." Now, watching my mother help Abuela Rosa prepare traditional Puerto Rican dishes while chatting with Carmen's parents in her slowly improving Spanish, I marveled at the transformations that had taken place. Leo found me in the living room, looking through photo albums with Carmen. "Miss Ivy, look," Carmen said, pointing to a picture of Leo at his high school graduation. "Professor Ev says he was the smartest boy in his whole school." "He still is," I said, catching Leo's eye. He smiled, but I could see the emotion there, the healing that was still happening, the wounds that were still sensitive but no longer raw. Over dinner, As we went around the table sharing what we were grateful for, my mother's voice broke when it was her turn to speak. "I'm grateful for second chances," she said, "and for the people who taught me that it's never too late to become who you're supposed to be." Carmen, sitting between my mother and Leo, raised her hand like she was in school. "I'm grateful for Professor Ev and Leo for teaching me that I'm smart enough for anything." Later, as we cleaned up the dishes, Leo pulled me aside. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small wrapped box, and my heart started racing. "Leo, before you panic," he said with a smile, "it's not what you think. Not yet, anyway. But it is something I wanted to give you." Inside the box was a delicate silver necklace with a small pendant, a tiny open book with words engraved in tiny script. "Read it," he said. I held it up to the light and read the inscription. "Te amo sin saber cómo, ni cuándo, ni de dónde." "It's the Neruda line you quoted the day we met," I said, tears springing to my eyes. "The one you said was better in English translation," Leo said with a grin. "I wanted to remind you that some things are worth preserving in their original form, even if it takes time to understand their true meaning." As he fastened the necklace around my neck, I thought about how much truth was contained in those simple words about love that appears without explanation, without warning, without pedigree, the love that had grown between us despite everything that should have kept us apart. "I love you too," I whispered, "sin saber cómo, ni cuándo, ni de dónde." From the kitchen, we could hear my mother laughing at something Abuela Rosa had said, her voice light and genuinely joyful in a way I'd rarely heard it. Carmen was teaching her parents a song she'd learned at school, while Leo's grandmother provided percussion by tapping wooden spoons against the counter. It wasn't the family I'd grown up with, but it was the family we'd chosen to build together, messy and complicated, and beautiful in its imperfection. "What are you thinking about?" Leo asked, following my gaze toward the kitchen. "I'm thinking about how destruction sometimes creates space for something better to grow," I said. "How sometimes you have to break everything down to build it back up right." He nodded, understanding. "Your mother is going to be okay, you know. Different, but okay. What about you? Are you going to be okay?" Leo was quiet for a moment, considering. "I'm getting there. Some days are harder than others, but I'm getting there." He squeezed my hand. "Having you helps. Having a future helps." "What does that future look like?" "Well," he said, his eyes sparkling with mischief, "I was thinking we could start with graduate school, both of us. There's this program at Yale that focuses on community-based education and social justice in literature." My heart leaped. "You applied?" "We applied. I may have taken the liberty of submitting your application along with mine. I hope you don't mind." I threw my arms around him, laughing. "Are you serious?" "Dead serious. We got in. Full funding, research assistantships, the works. Your mother's recommendation letter for you was, well, let's just say it was the most honest and powerful thing she's ever written." I pulled back to look at him. "When do we start?" "Next fall, if you want to." Did I want to? The thought of leaving my comfortable teaching position, of diving back into the academic world that had nearly destroyed Leo, should have been terrifying. But instead, it felt like coming home. What would we study? How to make education accessible to everyone. How to break down the barriers that keep people like me out of academic spaces. How to train teachers to see potential instead of deficits. His voice grew stronger, more passionate. How to make sure no other kid goes through what I went through. It was perfect. It was everything I'd never known I wanted. "Yes," I said without hesitation. "Yes, absolutely yes." From the kitchen came the sound of my mother attempting to sing Carmen's song in Spanish, her pronunciation terrible, but her enthusiasm genuine. Carmen was giggling, gently correcting her, while Abuela Rosa offered encouraging commentary. "She's really trying," Leo said, following my gaze. "She really is. Do you think you can forgive her, eventually?" I considered the question seriously. A year ago, I would have said there was nothing to forgive. My mother was perfect, above reproach. 6 months ago, I would have said her crimes were unforgivable. But now, "I think forgiveness isn't a destination," I said finally. "It's a process, and I think we're all somewhere in the middle of that process." Leo nodded. "That's very wise. I learned it from someone who's much wiser than I am." "Your mother?" "You," I said, kissing him softly. "You, who survived something terrible and found a way to build something beautiful from the pieces." As the evening wound down and our guests prepared to leave, my mother pulled me aside. I have something to tell you, she said, her voice nervous but determined. What is it? I've been offered a position, teaching adult literacy classes at the Hartford Public Library. It doesn't pay much, and it's nothing like my old job, but… She paused, searching for words. It feels right. It feels like what I'm supposed to be doing. Mom, that's wonderful. I wanted to ask your permission first. I stared at her in surprise. My permission. You're the teacher in the family now, she said simply. The real teacher. I wanted to make sure you thought I was ready. The role reversal was complete, and it should have felt strange, but instead, it felt exactly right. I think you're more than ready, I told her. I think you're going to be extraordinary. She hugged me then, really hugged me, for the first time in longer than I could remember. I'm proud of you, she whispered, for who you've become, for who you've chosen to love, for the teacher you are. I'm proud of the woman you've become despite my failures as a mother. Not despite them, I said, surprising myself with the words. Because of them. Everything that happened led us here, to this moment, to this family we've built together. I wouldn't change any of it, and I meant it. The pain, the revelations, the destruction of everything I'd thought I knew. It had all led to this, to Leo and me planning a future built on justice and education, to my mother finally becoming the person she was meant to be, to a new understanding of what family could look like when it was based on choice rather than obligation, love rather than tradition. As everyone said their goodbyes, and Leo and I began the drive back to my apartment, I found myself thinking about the Neruda poem again. I love you without knowing how, or when, or from where. Love that appears without explanation, without warning, without the right credentials or background or preparation. Love that survives even the worst revelations about ourselves and our families. Love that creates space for growth and forgiveness and new beginnings. What are you smiling about? Leo asked, noticing my expression. I'm thinking about how this all started, I said. With you reading poetry in a coffee shop, and me thinking I knew better than you about translation. You did think that, he said with a grin. Very presumptuous of you. I was wrong about a lot of things back then. We all were, but we figured it out eventually. Did we? I feel like we're still figuring it out. Maybe that's the point, Leo said thoughtfully. Maybe the figuring out is more important than having it all figured out. I reached over and took his hand, feeling the weight of the necklace around my throat. The promise it represented not just of love, but of growth, of becoming better than we were. I love you, Leonardo Martinez, I said. Scholarship kid, brilliant translator, survivor, teacher, the man who saved my family by telling us the truth about ourselves. I love you too, Ivy Thornfield, he replied. Privileged daughter, dedicated teacher, bridge builder, the woman who chose love over loyalty, truth over comfort. As we drove through the Hartford night, past the neighborhood where Leo had grown up, past the university where he'd been broken and was now planning to return triumphant, I felt something I'd never experienced before, complete certainty about the future. Not certainty that it would be easy or that there wouldn't be more challenges, more moments of doubt and pain and growth, but certainty that whatever came, we would face it together, with honesty and courage, and the kind of love that doesn't ask for credentials or explanations, the kind of love that simply says, I see you, I choose you, I will build something beautiful with you from whatever pieces we have.